The problem with being super and hyper focused on any one specific topic means that you're going to, by nature, miss a lot of different details that, while aren't necessarily within the field of study that you're looking at, necessarily affects your particular thing that you're looking at. And the EV industry and the renewables industry and all the channels associated with that fall into that category. We live in a world of specialists, and specialists are really good at knowing a lot of information about the specific thing that they're looking for. The problem is that when you don't have enough generalists out there who know a little bit about a lot to kind of put puzzle pieces together, you miss important facts that kind of change the point of view that people who are hyper-focused on a specific thing necessarily kind of get wrong. What am I talking about? Well, absolutely. The things that are pointed out in Matt Ferrell's latest video when it comes to the laws that are being passed here in the United States, he has some good points. The idea of limiting ourselves, especially in this time of want that we live in, doesn't seem like a particularly smart thing to do. I do agree that laws that make it harder for any one particular technology to blossom and flourish are kind of stupid. That said, there is something to be said for kind of pulling back from certain agendas that are being pushed forward into the world that could lock us into a problem that is coming in the relatively near future. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the idea that China is going to be a superpower in this century. There's a lot of people who believe that China is going to be a major superpower that is going to rival the United States here in the next century, and I don't know. I don't know that I agree with that. Now, I will tell you that some of my opinions are coming a lot from a gentleman named Peter Zeihan, who I know a lot of people don't like. I know a lot of people think he doesn't know what he's talking about, and maybe he doesn't. That's fine. You don't have to agree with his predictions. I think that just based off of the data that he's referencing, data that is real, data that even if you go by China's and Russia's own numbers, you at least have to listen to the theory, okay? The idea that China is going to be a major superpower is kind of foiled just by their own demographics, right? Are they going to fall apart as a nation in the next 10 years? I don't know. I think maybe, people like Peter Zeihan and those who follow that particular viewpoint might be going a little bit extreme with their predictions. I think that Russia's done. Their exploits in Ukraine and the way that they've prosecuted that war have made it very clear that not only do they not have the population to continue sustaining a large Russian country, they also just don't have the leadership to hold that all together. Just the fact that they weren't able to just run in and steamroll everybody kind of shows you where they are with that. But you look at China, you look at the numbers and the revised numbers that have come out, and the millions and millions of people they said they had that it turns out that they don't. The one-child policy that gutted their demographics, and the fact that the culture there has changed in a way that makes it very difficult for young people to really do anything. And the workforce that they've had for the last 40 years evaporates out from under them, and their ability to continue producing things at an even reasonable even reasonable price for what we would consider reasonable these days just kind of goes out the window. Now, you have to look at this stuff in the context of how everything kind of interplays together. When it comes to wages, China has already risen as far as their actual people making money. Their wage that they have has increased quite a lot. They are no longer the cheapest workforce out there. Obviously, I think Mexico is actually a fair bit cheaper. These are not numbers that I've looked up myself, so you have to go look at that on your own. But my understanding is that Mexico is actually a really good place to go if you want to get quality work done at a reasonable price, because China has risen to the point where it can demand more money, and their citizens have risen to the point where they can demand more money. And, anytime a country grows up to a certain point, wages go up. That's why we offshored all of our stuff. So when it comes to renewables and all of these things that China has been dominating for the last 20 plus years, it makes sense when you just look at it on the surface that, oh, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that we do this with that, this and that with China. But the problem is a couple of things. The first and foremost, the demographic problems that they're having. China is almost certainly not going to be a superpower. It's not going to be an equal rival to the United States because they missed their window of opportunity to get to that point. Their demographics fell out from under them before they had a chance to really get what they needed to put themselves out there on the global stage permanently. And, you know, the younger generations, in addition to the fact that there's just not nearly as many of them, and the fact that they're going to be caring for their elderly, and the fact that there's, you know, they just don't have the oomph that they had 20 years ago. I don't know. I don't know that they're just going to fall apart like Peter Zeihan says, where it's going to be, you know, they're going to go back to their traditional provinces and cities and city-states and things like that. Maybe not. I don't know. But I do think that their demographic problem is something that they're not going to be able to solve. And even if they could solve it, I don't think they have enough time before their economy maybe not collapses, but withdraws to the point where they're just not able to really function that much anymore. But then you also just look at the material side of things. And I do agree with Peter Zeihan on his point that, you know, the materials required to do this renewable revolution that everybody wants, I don't know that we're going to be able to do that. Especially if China falls off the stage as a major influence in the world. One of the things we don't like to think about is just the fact that, you know, regardless of the Chinese wages, China does do some pretty unethical things when it comes to different people in their country and using them for labor. I'll let you pick the word for that. But when you look at the way that China operates, I mean, we've all talked about how if you own a smartphone, you support wage-free labor, right? You just do, because the parts that go into those phones, a lot of the manual labor stuff that goes into either acquiring the material for that or even just putting those individual components together, it's done by people who aren't getting paid for their work or who are getting paid very, very, very little for their work. And we can only afford them because the countries like China do that. So my message with this video isn't necessarily to dog on Matt Ferrell for, you know, looking at the renewables crisis that we're about to go through and only seeing that. The reality is that the world itself is about to go through a major crisis, and I agree with the idea that a lot of that's going to be the demographic problem. The baby boomer generation gave us so much as far as production, and you know, the later generations are just a lot smaller, and it's going to be much harder to keep up with that. Automation will help to some degree, but I think we're a long way off from the kind of automation that replaces workers in general. Certain fields, like the fields that I was in, like office work and things like that, sure. But all that really does is push those of us who were trying to get a better life through education and, you know, going after jobs that were not manual labor to save our bodies so that we didn't have to freaking, you know, kill ourselves for a living. It pushes us all back down the ladder. Am I saying that manual labor jobs are necessarily worse than office jobs? No, but there is a cost to be paid for doing manual labor work when it comes to your body, and that is something you have to consider for your future. You know, the more you're out there hurting your body doing physical labor work, like it's not that you're better if you're doing an office job. It's just there's consequences to everything, and the consequence to manual labor is you're wearing your body out faster. That's just the way that it is, and that's why a lot of people wanted to get into office work, so that when they got older, they hadn't already ruined their body, and they can have a reasonable, you know, older years, and that's what a lot of us have been trying to get to. So it's not a class thing. It's not an I'm better than you thing. It's not any of that. It's just, you know, later quality of life depends on what you do with your early life. And if you spend all of your life doing hard physical labor, then when you get old, you're going to have a hard time living. It's just the way that it is. And yeah, unfortunately, the automation that we have is mostly going towards the low-hanging fruit of office work and all of the jobs that software could more or less do on their own, rather than trying to get the robots out there to do all the hard labor stuff. And those of us who did that stuff are getting pushed into the hard labor stuff, and that's just the way that goes. And the same thing is true over in China. I mean, they don't have robots over there any earlier than we have, right? It's all going to come out at the same time for everybody. And, you know, Yeah, that might help with manufacturing a little bit, but there are demographic issues over there. Like here in the United States, we aren't in the best shape, but we seem to be better off than most other countries. So we have a little while before we catch up with everybody else. But the rest of the world is really suffering from some severe demographic problems that are going to cause their workforce, whatever you want to call it, to just kind of collapse out from under them. And they're going to have a hard time even just maintaining where they are, much less staving off some kind of economic collapse. So that's what I wanted to say. You can't watch one video and form an opinion on a subject, because what ends up happening is you hear what the person has to say based off of their idea of what they think should be happening, and you ignore all of the other factors out there that affect the situation that they're talking about. Is renewables and electric vehicles and all of those things objectively a better solution versus, fossil fuels and things like that? Of course they are. No reasonable person would say that we should prefer fossil fuels over EVs and solar and wind and all of that stuff. No reasonable person would say that. Nobody without an agenda would say that, because obviously polluting our atmosphere and, even a little bit of an increase in global warming caused by us is not a smart thing to do. But at the same time, we live in a world where reality forces us to do things we might not want to do. And unfortunately, because we focused so hard on fossil fuels before we knew the consequences, and we built our economies and our infrastructures around fossil fuels, switching over to EVs is not something that EVs and renewables and all that stuff is not something you can just flip a switch and do. It takes time. And unfortunately, we are rapidly running out of it. And it's unlikely that we're going to have the infrastructure and supply chains in place, even with China and Africa and all of these countries where we get even just the raw materials for the renewables things that we try to do. Even with those things, it's unlikely that we're going to get it done before the demographic collapse of most of the world. And, even if we do, maintaining those supply chains to keep everybody in a car just doesn't seem feasible. Which is why a lot of people are really focusing on fossil fuels and carbon capture and trying to make it so that, we can sustain the fossil fuel things as long as we can, so that hopefully we get through this dip in demographics and eventually get to another baby boom at some point, and then can kind of turn it around. But for those of us who have to live through all of that, that means our entire life is going to be in a down slope. And unfortunately, if you were born around the time that I was born, your entire life has felt like one big downward sloping line, because we're on the back end of the prosperous era of the world. It just is what it is. So, I know that was a lot of doom and gloom, but sometimes reality is doom and gloom, and you have to think about that stuff. So thanks for watching. Be sure to click the like button. Subscribe to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and I'll see you for the next one.